the big actual problems within climate tech are all hardware. And so the markets there are also huge, and we need solutions like that to actually start decarbonizing. So we are expecting still a couple of really big players to emerge within the next 5 to 10 years. But for most of the ones that we see, you need to get into a sort of first of a kind plan, which is about TRL 7, 8. So it also makes sense that there's also a good financial return whenever these projects, whenever these plants actually succeed when they're actually set up. But my whole reasoning of why I wanted to do it is I figured, okay, it must be one of the most complex things. Everything needs to be engineered way stronger. Everything is so much more complex because we're going completely away from everything that we know and that's been tested. So I figured, okay, if we can master that, we can also master everything just on the Earth's surface.
Hey, I'm Al, and this is the Paglalayag podcast. I'm using this podcast to showcase what's going on around me in the hardware and cleantech sectors dito sa Philippines. With guests from across the startup, research, investment, and enabler ecosystems, Paglalayag focuses on the stories and inspirations that motivate us to start up in hardware and press on down this arduous path of steering our economy away from the looming climate catastrophe that makes itself increasingly felt in our lives each passing year. I hope you'll find this cast of characters as impressive and inspiring as I do. Also, if you've been listening to these podcasts and want to let me know what you think, there's a survey form available at paglalayag.net-podcast. You can also reach out by email at pal@paglalayag.net. I'd love to hear from you. Sige, tuloy-tuloy lang. Let's jump in. Okay, so welcome everybody to Paglalayag. I'm Al, and today I'm joined by Floren Velde, an early stage investor for Plug and Play Ventures. Floren caught my eye on LinkedIn a while ago with a presentation he gave about the geothermal startup landscape at Plug and Play's annual conference recently. As a mechanical engineer by training, I thought it'd be fun to chat about where things are at in geothermal these days. Probably many of our listeners will be aware that the Philippines is one of the big geothermal producers, third worldwide, behind only US and Indonesia, with more than a gigawatt of installed capacity. So, Floren, thanks a lot for joining me today.
Absolutely, Al. Great to be here.
Cool. And why don't we get started by just telling us a little bit about yourself and how you got involved with Plug and Play and geothermal?
Yeah, for sure. So I've been at Plug and Play for about a year right now. I work specifically in energy ventures for the Americas team. How we got into it. So within Plug and Play Energy, we have a couple of focus areas. Anything from green and renewable generation is a big part of that. We have gotten some interest from partners of ours around geothermal energy, which is why we decided to look deeper into the topic and just map the startup landscape and the value chain that just comes with it.
Great. And before that, you were with KU Leuven. Did I say that right? Out of Belgium?
So exactly. So what I did before is I graduated as a mechanical engineer. I did aerospace tech specialization in KU Leuven. I'm also from Belgium. Then I did 1 year master management at IE Business School. I also had a startup for about 1 year, which is called Creofin. I decided to round that off really because of team, but also market conditions that were just really not ideal.
What was
And
it?
then it was actually a working capital financing solution for agricultural inputs, specifically for the French market, but really because of interest rates that were rising systematically at that time, we felt like it was not the best thing to keep going with it. So yeah, at that point, I then decided to stop with it. Also, just from a personal point, I've always been super interested in anything energy related, climate related. It's also one of the reasons that just got me into engineering overall. And I believe would have loved to focus on something like that, but really because of the team that we had initially, because of our overall skills and the complementary that skills that we had, we decided to look into fintech and start something in there. But yeah, after a while you realize, okay, this is not really what you're supposed to do, or what is sort of meant for yourself. So I decided, okay, this is not something I see myself doing for the next 5 to 10 years. So I decided to, okay, I only want to look at anything climate tech. I love to do it within VC. I was also thinking of joining a startup scale up where I would just really believe in the team. But in the end, I decided to go for VC really because you have more of a helicopter view. You see so many different startups. You also just learn what startups make sense, what the recipe is to really scale something. And that's really why I started looking into different firms. I got into plug and play, or I came across plug and play really because I had a friend from a few years back. She was working, actually, we also ended up working in the same team in Valencia. And she told me all about how it works. But what I really liked is that we have all these corporate partners that we can also just connect with relevant startups in their field. And in that sense, this is actually a very important part of startups that actually want to scale up. Definitely when it's hardware intensive or just anything that is B2B, you need these large corporate clients. And this is something that Plug and Play really pushes for, to get the really good startups out of the sort of, to identify all of them and to bring them in touch with larger corporates that could really benefit from a solution like that. So that's something I really liked, and that's something we also try to do now, specifically in energy with oil and gas and EPC partners, also utility partners from all across the world.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, that's I could definitely see where you're going with that, and definitely appreciated like for us getting our solution on the road and demonstrated the institutionals or big corporate clients. They've kind of got the clout that we don't have when we're just getting started with no reputation or anything. So definitely
Mhm.
hear what you're saying there. And then how about with the EU Agency for Space program?
This is something I've been helping with as well in the last couple of months. So what we're doing there, it's a program. It's called the Cassini Space Accelerator, something that Plug and Play and a couple of other program partners set up with the European Commission. And in the program, we accelerate space startups that are really ready to get commercialized. And we connect them with relevant mentors. They go on a business trip, and they get a lot of mentoring advice within the program itself. My role in it is I'm a lead coach, so I'm connecting several of these startups with then the right mentors and just being their weekly point of contact to make sure if they need anything that I can connect them further within the couple of organizations that we work with.
Well, how, like what you're saying you were doing with space as a mechanical engineer, like in university, is it a lot of parallels? Like where is the, I guess, the leading edge of that kind of stuff at the moment?
Yeah, I would say the angle is pretty different. In university, everything was very technical. Also, I did a aerospace tech specialization, which was about 25% of my master's. The rest is really mechanical engineering, anything from sensors or just literally bulbs or just engines, all these kind of things. My specialization was mainly also on aviation, aircraft stability, aircraft engines, and I had one space course, which really talked a lot about orbital mechanics. I think what these startups are working on is it's a very different angle. It's really the startup point of view. There's mainly two categories. You have upstream solutions, downstream solutions. Upstream talks about new types of propulsion systems, actual hardware up in space, which I would say is more related to also what I studied. And downstream solutions are mainly using existing satellite data, a lot of these sources, and doing the data processing really on it, combining it with AI, for example, to give really good insights onto actually for example, insurance cases, or even in the case of geothermal, for example, for site discoveries, you could also use downstream applications. So it's a very different perspective that you get now in Cassini, which I really like. You learn a little bit more about the market. You learn how they are also commercializing. So it's a very interesting complement to just my studies.
One thing you mentioned there about insurance based on remote sensing. To what extent do you think that there's solutions coming out that can help with the increasing level of typhoons these days and how that affects agricultural yields, farmers and stuff?
Question, yeah. So a lot of what these companies really work on is the predictions, is really the AI part of, okay, using any kind of previous data as well, and just predicting what could happen within the next months, weeks. And in that sense, farmers as well, they can make certain alterations to what they planned, to how will they protect their crops as well, how they would cope with it. And this is very interesting information also definitely as well when you're trying to ensure these. So these are it could help from a lot of different perspectives. So
But I
it could
guess
be super valuable.
they would probably need to be like teamed up with an actuarial or like somebody with like some kind
Yeah.
of insurance company that's already offering, because these startups probably aren't offering policies themselves.
Yeah. They are not. So these startups they will work together with insurance companies,
Right.
and these insurance companies they have their channels in place, and they will then also, for example, work together with large agricultural companies in that sense. Yeah. So what a lot of definitely in insurance. I mean, I'm not in insurtech per se, so I cannot speak so much on this topic, but my from what it seems, from what I've heard, is that this is an area where it's very hard to really scale through if you're not collaborating with any large insurance companies. That's also why we actually have a very large insurtech vertical, again, a plug and play. But yeah, so that's it's a very vital component of scaling through.
Definitely believe you. Cool. So if we get into the geothermal report, then getting into to my house a little bit, how would you summarize your talk of the geothermal industry or the startup scene in 2024?
I would say it's from what we've seen, it's a very interesting point right now because we've seen two very interesting years the last couple of years. 2022 was, of course, like there was 2021, 2022, there was overall an investment boom, but definitely 2022, there was a serious boom for geothermal investment, the highest number ever recorded and significantly higher as well in 21 and 2020. And that really had a lot to do with what was happening definitely in Europe with the whole Russia-Ukraine conflict. Energy security just became a very important topic anywhere around the world. And geothermal energy is just a very good proposition in that sense. It's fully based on something that the grid would need. It uses lifespan. So, and all of that with a very competitive levelized cost of energy. So it's a very interesting proposition, and it caught the eye of a lot of VCs in 2022. And what is also something that we've seen is that last year, 2023, was actually an M&A record year for anything in the geothermal space. We saw geothermal scale-ups that were acquiring sort of older, more mature players that just had a lot of infrastructure or abandoned sites still in their portfolio, and they saw that as a way to scale up faster. We also saw just large software companies, for example, acquiring smaller players that were doing something very specific in, let's say, subsurface analysis. So in that sense, we've seen two very exciting years, and we are seeing a couple of areas, a couple of innovation areas that have attracted significant funding, but still are not very, that don't really have a very high number of startups in them. So we are expecting still a couple of really big players to emerge within the next 5 to 10 years. So it's a very exciting space to start looking at it. And in terms of maturity of the space, we believe we are really still in a relatively early stage of it, definitely as well in terms of deployment. There's not that much deployment globally at the moment. And yeah, there's a couple of reasons of why that number is still relatively low, but we are seeing a lot of startups that are trying to bring that number up. That's really exciting to see.
Cool. I'm gonna guess a little bit, like if we were to try and use a similar upstream and downstream sort of framing that you mentioned with the space sector, and you talked about people buying up infrastructure and that's like sort of the downstream group, the ones that are trying to build up projects, build up reservoirs, perhaps a little bit of exploration.
And then you get these groups that are doing maybe fracking technologies or seal like casing or high temperature sensors or these sorts of things. Is that how you sort of classify it? That's what I remember from some of the geothermal conferences that I went to before I got going with Sunny.
You could, yeah, that's a possible way of categorizing it. I think how we how we categorize it so far, there's a couple different ones which I think are just pretty useful of just categorizing different systems. You can, of course, categorize anything closed loop, open loop. That's the first one. You can just differentiate with just residential, industrial power generation systems. That's also an important one. You can differentiate across the value chain, which is also something that we've done. If in the value chain, we looked anything from exploration to just first mapping, is there a potential project here, subsurface analysis, simulations, all the way to then extracting that heat all the way to the surface. That's the second step. To then converting it in a third step into the power, sort of the end product that we were looking for, whether it's just heat or whether it's power. And then as a fourth step, we also just put any kind of process innovation into end developers, for example, and so on. So these are interesting categorization, but I think, yeah, what you mentioned makes sense as well. You could also look at it from actual developer point of view. So there's definitely a lot of integrators that group existing technologies that are sort of off the shelf, that are ready to go commercial, and they start actually setting up these projects. But we also have a lot of players that are extremely niche, that really focus on a very specific part of the value chain. For example, in drilling, any kind of working fluids. It could go, yeah, all the way, for example, to just sensors, optic fibers in there. So it all sort of has its function. And yeah, so there's a lot of different ways to look at it, depending on what you're, of course, looking to get out of a landscape or just looking to learn in the space.
Yeah, definitely. There's a certain, I mean, in the process of investing, you're actually the first investor that we've had on the show, but in the Philippines is not necessarily as mature of a startup market here. So
Mm.
of course, the classic startup is for software, a software as a service sort of thing that can doesn't have that much capex for scaling or anything like that, in the same way that hardware does. And so there's a lot of people that are sort of evangelists in the space, or people like coaching and giving advice, who will strongly encourage you to be very, very attentive to what the market's asking for and those sorts of things. But that has never been particularly well. I mean, I recognize it as good, solid advice, but it's somehow missing the mark for a company like us that has this extra hardware component and the scaling component. And I've always, like, because I hear about it so much from the people in the space, I was really glad to see from Climate Base, I think they're called. They had this scaling hardware playbook that they released a while ago.
Mm.
And they talked about like putting up facilities and things like that as kind of the name of the game, or an important component of that financing and going through the motions. That is very nice framing for it compared to the much more openly available information that you'll get on the internet about how to like scale a software only startup.
Mhm.
And I think one of the really key pieces that they're missing, that I guess maybe isn't really showing up in the Philippines yet, but I hope one of these days it will, is the idea that when you have a sophisticated market of investors, people are starting to form opinion or investment theses that
Mhm.
where they actually sort of have their concept of where the market is going, and they start going and looking for companies that fit that bill with the technology and stuff. I don't know. I don't know if you would comment on that, if you agree or disagree, or if anything comes to mind for you, like how you see the
Um,
differences there.
yeah, so 100%. It's a very different approach to investing in hardware compared to software. That's absolutely true. And I think that's a risk for generalist firms that sometimes are not as used to a the typical hardware cycle. So going to like an actual commercial project or just product, it will take you quite a number of years. For startups that are doing really well to get to a TRL level 9, that could take them definitely about 5 years, all the way from inception, something like 5, 6 years. Two good examples, for example, that we have in geothermal are Ever and Fervo, that are both very strongly VC backed, raised in total, each one around 400 million, both based in the US as well. And they are sort of working with a cycle like that. What is, yeah, even within the hardware, I think I know what report you're talking about. I think it was a really good one, sort of the building blocks to scale hardware. And also in there, it actually distinguishes between different types of hardware startups. Some actually have a product that is just less difficult to commercialize. Some are actual moonshots. And also timelines in that sense will be different. But for most of the ones that we see, you need to get into a sort of an important milestone is to get to that first of a kind plan, which is about TRL 7, 8. Up to that, you can do some pilots that you can also just charge a little bit of revenue for. But that's an important milestone, because when that is actually proven, you can also start attracting that project financing. You can actually start scaling up. Up to that point, it's going to be mainly equity funding, which is of course very expensive, and you can only do a certain amount of rounds before you need to get to a decent stage. Otherwise, VCs definitely will just not be interested anymore, because you will be diluted so much and you won't have any skin in the game anymore. So that's just a very important thing to just consider in terms of timeline when investing in hardware. Now, that being said, their returns on hardware startups, in most cases, actually, in a lot of cases, they could outperform software investments as well, because certain areas, for example, also SaaS, there's also a lot of voices saying that perhaps SaaS is also over. The big actual problems within climate tech are all hardware. And so the markets there are also huge, and we need solutions like that to actually start decarbonizing. So it also makes sense that there's also a good financial return whenever these projects, whenever these plants actually succeed, when they're actually set up. So it's more a matter of timeline and being patient in some ways, and just knowing what to expect, more than having a different type of financial return, because the returns can also be very high, and it can definitely be a very lucrative space. Something you mentioned, the Philippines a couple of times. From my side, I've actually seen almost all the startups that we constantly run into are North America based or Europe based. We've seen very few examples just in any other area in the world. Singapore is maybe an exception. Southeast Asia, there's a couple of exciting ones. Australia could also be exciting. There's also a good network there. I think it has a lot to do as well, just with the capital that's out there. The US has a very high number of VCs, of CVCs, of just large established companies are also excited to collaborate, or just to tap into certain spaces. There's a lot of spin outs as well, big
Well, I also got
universities.
the
So
you
yeah,
also got the geysers right there in California. So right where all the VCs are is where like the biggest geothermal reservoir in the world is. So
exactly. That also helps. Yeah, West Coast is right by Ring of Fire, so that's true. But yeah, exactly. That capital is a huge factor of why it's actually like in the West, let's say, there's just a bit more appetite to just also explore those hardware solutions, and also perhaps because of the whole climate story is much more alive in North America, and definitely in Europe, of course, to start decarbonizing. Also, just regulations are much more in place. So, of course, that attracts a lot of people to start developing something. Definitely also in the case of geothermal, I guess those are just a couple of reasons why there's a big difference just in terms of ecosystem.
yeah, definitely. One of the groups that seems to, that in the States they seem to be excited about Fervo Energy.
Right.
They're doing some they're basically, as I understand it, in Ohio trying to bring the advancements that they've made in the oil and gas fracking industry into geothermal. I don't know that much about their reservoir, but just when I was looking around, that's where people seem to be putting the buzz right now for it. How did you feel about what you saw from them?
Yeah. So in terms of systems that are exciting, that are being developed, there's three really exciting categories just for power generation that they're just getting a lot of attention. First one is EGS, so enhanced or engineered geothermal systems, which is Fervo. Second one is AGS, so those are advanced geothermal systems. Great example there is Ever, based in Canada. And then we also have supercritical system developers, but those are less mature. There's still a lot of the R&D going on in that space.
Yeah.
So we can, and honestly, also we can have supercritical systems of AGS and both EGS. So it's sort of a next step in both of those systems.
Yeah.
Typical for an EGS system is EGS is open loop. And what's pretty unique about it is that they use different types of techniques actually from fracking industry. So often the people in these startups, they also come from an ONG background. They usually go with horizontal drilling techniques, for example, to actually pump water in sort of these fracks that they make. It heats up in these fracks, and then they actually pump it up again. So the advantage here is that you can actually get you actually have more contact surface. You actually get higher heat from the similar depths that you go the heat is much higher than you would have with a more traditional setup where you just go to certain aquifers. It's also handy if you don't have those aquifers there already. So in that sense, EGS systems, they are less location dependent as well. The disadvantage of EGS system is that you are
You gotta
actually like
make
you
you
are
gotta make it.
exactly you
Whereas
gotta make
it's not like
true.
in the volcano where you're like drilling down and there's the steam. Well, I mean, when you hit it, it's hard enough to hit it as well. But like around
Exactly.
here, the off of the side of Mount McKeeling, which is not very far from where I am. When I first arrived, there's one group called My Barara, and they were in the process of adding another 60 megawatts to the existing 120 or 150 that they already had. So that's like they've already got the reservoir and they build it out. And you could conceivably expand that reservoir through these sorts of techniques as well. But if you're going into like a whole new area where there's like it's just straight up rock, then you're like building a reservoir and then you got to put the water in there. Where's the water going to come from? And
Exactly, exactly. That's true. Some some other real disadvantages is, yeah, of course, like because we are fracking, there's more seismic risk as well that we have. We're also messing more with sort of these aquifers compared to, for example, a closed loop system. But in general, it is a really exciting just route that is being explored, really just because the return or just the power also of that system is just way higher. If we compare that, honestly, I'm a big fan as well of AGS systems. With an AGS system, we're actually going closed loop. We're going to similar depths, actually, but we have the full-on casing, and we also have a specific working fluid that we can use that's different than water. For example, we could go to supercritical CO2. We could go to
Mhm.
any kind of refrigerant, for example, that we also add to the water. And in that sense, we actually need to pump way less, or sometimes we don't even need to pump. So it sort of auto circulates because of the different characteristics of that working fluid. But the really good thing is we are not sort of constantly fracking those aquifers, and in that sense, we are not really interfering much with the underground. So there's less seismic risk, there's less contamination just underground. The big disadvantage is that it's very expensive. Overall, it's considered much more expensive. And also you have, because of course your fluid is also separated, you do have less contact surface between your fluid and your actual hot rock because it's just more separated. So in that sense, your extraction tends to be a little bit lower. So you need to invest then more again into your system.
Yeah. The
But
hack that they if you remember Gross Schönebeck, that was like one of the EGS systems they tried in southern Germany. What I understood of that one is it was like these really, really deep sandstone reservoirs. So it was reservoirs. They didn't necessarily have a lot of water in them already, or the stuff that was in there is really saline.
Mhm.
But there was the water, and then it was like somehow capped. So there were these two different channels of sandstone, and then Something in my mind has me remembering igneous rocks on top, which is a really weird thing to have happen. I don't know if it was volcanic or what, but that's the way I remember the description of it. But I might be wrong. I might just be remembering it wrong. But what they were trying to do is get it to go from one to the other and be able to pull out of the other one. And that's. But I think that what ended up being the biggest problem with that is that the fractures that it was supposed to travel through from one to the other kept getting squeezed shut again or something like that. Something like that. I wasn't close to the project. I was just hearing like reports when I was still a student, but yeah, it was interesting because when I was an undergraduate, there were a bunch of the Germans who were involved in that project were like collaborating with different researchers at our university.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that makes sense because sort of stimulating all that activity, actually those reservoirs that you then create is a big part as well of actually, for example, also Fervo, what really makes it unique. So they have very specific sensors and very specific ways of then stimulating that. So yeah, that is a big uncertainty, but that's also sort of the key what makes your system or your prototype as well generate that much power in that location. And that's sort of what also sets them apart. So yeah, it totally makes sense.
Yeah, it's cool. But like with the EGS, like I mean, like what you're saying, I mean, you're starting to have to crack like harder technical nuts of like how do you actually get your drill casings and stuff to be able to do it. I remember if you've ever been to the Stanford workshop, that's like Stanford is one of the like longest running labs for EGS systems. And Roland Horn, when I was looking for a thesis project, I went down to that thing and met him. And he was on a podcast just a little while ago, and he had a story about how one of the projects were actually, instead of producing water, they were producing black steam. And the blackness was coming from the drill casings as the drill was going down, it was getting like corroded and dissolved by the fluids that were coming back up. So the actual drill bit was coming back up with the fluid. I've also heard some stories. I remember working in a mineral exploration camp, and there was an Icelandic guy there, and he was actually on the drill. I don't know if you heard about this, like when they actually managed to drill into a magma chamber, and the magma actually came shooting back out of the drill hole.
Whoa.
Yeah, that guy actually was working on that drill rig, just like randomly encountered him at this other unrelated project.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's not what you want, but
Well, I mean, it was the goal of the project. I don't know how it affected their equipment, but it was the goal of the project. Put in there. So we call it small wins. Small wins. You get them, take them when you get them. And then like the salts that are inside the drill holes sometimes come back harder than the rock itself. So like if they don't keep the pressure or whatever and it comes out of solution, the salts like these borates or whatever, like it would be more expensive to try and drill and reopen that hole than to just drill another hole sometimes. Right. While the because of the pressures, because of the temperatures, because of the amount of time and those different salts and stuff.
yeah.
They're like they're way more saline than like ocean water, some of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's but what, like as they do start to do that, then like you said, the whole world is potentially a reservoir. Like you're no longer limited to these kind of geological freak show situations where you've got all that steam and stuff.
Exactly. So that's a very important point. So we also mapped three main challenges that we saw in what is holding really large deployment back at the moment. So a big part, so the three that we saw, first of all, we saw financing complexity, just because there's so much uncertainty. Usually, definitely with traditional systems, you can do some subsurface analysis, but sometimes you need to do a lot of different drilling on your site, and that makes it very difficult to do any kind of budgeting or just to get financing overall. So that's a big problem. Second of all is just the seismic complexity of things. There's been several earthquakes as well across Europe, but actually there was a big one as well specifically also EGS induced in 2017 in Korea. And that's also a difficulty. So actually that really precise monitoring, having systems that take that into consideration is a very important part. But then the third one is definitely location dependency. As you mentioned, sort of the world sort of becomes, the possibility to just do it anywhere is a very important value proposition. That's something definitely that these EGS and AGS systems are working on. Same with supercritical systems, just going to way higher temperatures, getting way more heat out of the underground, just at any location that we wanted, because it doesn't really make sense if we are setting up a system and we want to have more energy security as a country or even as a company on your land to put it in another location and just transfer that power again. You want to have it on the spot. And in that sense, that putting the system where you want it is a very important technical hurdle to overcome to get more deployment just everywhere. And it's exciting to see that we're seeing more of these developments, but definitely in amount of startups we have, and definitely the ones that have achieved any kind of unicorn status, it's still very limited. So we definitely expect more different systems, more different approaches that actually to emerge and to also definitely attract some large amount of funding in the next couple of years.
I mean, this is a bit of just another hokey story, but when I did a lot of tree planting when I was younger, so we spent a lot of time out in the forest. And while I was becoming a student of geothermal and geology, we had some nice rocks where we were. And so they, like with the whole like sweat lodge kind of thing, we would set up a hut and we would cover it all up and then get our rocks as like hot as we could and throw them in and get it so steamed that everybody was almost like passing out from the heat of it. And that was our way of like blowing off steam, so to speak, after working. And the rivers were nice big rocks. So to get them as hot as we could, we needed pretty big fires for it. And then to see the way you had to pace yourself in pulling the energy out of the rocks as they were coming through, and then they would crack through just from the pressure of the water in the rocks, as well as just, I mean, anything breaks when you put cold water on it too fast. It was interesting to see how much heat you could put in and how slowly it came out. And the Earth is a finite body, of course. Like we're not in space, or I mean, if you look in space, it's a finite body. So eventually, like we've taken a lot of fossil fuels out already, and that's one of the things that's pushing us to want to find other sources. And by taking all of this oil and coal out of the earth, we've put this carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And like at University of Alberta, they've got some carbon sequestration projects that propose putting that carbon back down again in the form of these like olivines and peridotite carbon into the rocks as a sequestration method. So when you're talking about CO2 steam, that's like kind of a funny dynamic of like putting the CO2 in to try and get it heated up, but then in some cases also putting it in as a sequestration method. I mean, when I'm thinking about the relevance of it, it's like in the realm of science fiction, because you would be doing such huge like systems, drilling way deeper than we can drill today. But yeah, I don't know. It's somehow the model would be quite interesting, because like there's certain minerals down in the earth that only exist. Like we couldn't reproduce them in the lab because they require so much pressure. And so, but now we're having challenges with like our reality and like atmospheric pressure with being able to create materials that are stable down there. And so it's just like a funky frontier. Like the people who go free diving, the people who push the limits of how deep into the water they can go, that whole challenge of like how do your blood vessels compress and all of those different things, as an alternative like academic or a technical pursuit, very, very different from other types of, I guess, science that you're doing that's very up above the surface all the time.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. There's still a lot of uncertainty of new types of projects. There's also a link with geothermal in this case, that there's been a couple of projects as well. There's been some research around this. If you just use anything, if you use carbon as just anything supercritical CO2, if you use that as some kind of working fluid, but in a sort of open loop system. And you, in that sense, you just pump more carbon into the underground, then you pump up. It sort of actually in that sense could store it as well. And because it actually heats up, sort of the cycle sort of keeps maintaining itself. That's something that is a very interesting concept as well. I haven't seen so many startups doing this successfully or at a commercial scale, but this is also I would say as well, because of your point that there's still so much uncertainty of what actually happens as well at those pressures and at those depths. So yeah, definitely viable point.
Lots of cool stuff for exploration. But in my case, I looked at it. I was like, I would need hundreds of millions of dollars to do anything in this space. I better go and find a different startup to start for now, because I don't have that kind of war chest. So, anyways, yeah, cool. So for this one, because I always do quotes at the end, just compare and contrast a couple quotes. So I picked one that's like kind of volcano oriented and one that's space oriented to contrast the two. So let's try see what you think of these.
Okay.
And then this one's even a little bit of like the frog in the boiling pot sort of, and with the global warming and this thing of needing to find alternative energy sources when we know this looming crisis is upon us. So George Santayana said that people never believe in volcanoes until the lava actually overtakes them. And then Carl Sagan says the sky calls to us. If we do not destroy ourselves, we will one day venture to the stars.
It's those are very real. Definitely right now. Yeah, I mean, I love, for example, the at the moment there's so much talk about anything AI. It's sort of overtaken climate also a little bit or overshadowed it. And it's definitely it's an incredible innovation. It's incredible what these companies and startups can do or are doing. But it's the effect in firsthand is not great on climate change. But I think it's also just important to not lose track of what's actually important for the just survival of the human race and of the planet over the next hundreds of years. And that won't be AI. It's something with a very short-term near effect. So I definitely agree with the first point. People don't really see this whole effects of climate change. A lot of people don't really realize why it's important to be working on these solutions. And it's up to a couple of people to make it also economically super viable and make it a win-win solution to get good technologies out there. And that's not really easy. But I love geothermal for the fact that it's beneficial to the grid. It's beneficial. It's fully renewable. Only difficulty sometimes is some environmental concerns around just water contamination or what you do with the brine and so on. But it's a great part of this whole chain of all the different solutions that we need to fully decarbonize. And yeah, hopefully before the lava hits us, right?
Nice. Yeah, I definitely think so. How about the part to the stars? What like I mean, what got you into space? Like how did you like what was it that was calling you to get into space as a university thing as an engineer?
So I'm not like also in my class, I was not the typical student, as in that I've always been dreaming about going to space or anything. I'm not, I don't really want to go to space, but my whole reasoning of why I wanted to do it is I figured, okay, it must be one of the most complex things. Everything needs to be engineered way stronger. Everything is so much more complex because we're going completely away from everything that we know and that's been tested. So I figured, okay, if we can master that, we can also master. It will be more easy to master everything just on the Earth's surface. I think that was sort of my idea to get the most out of my masters. And I don't know what's gonna happen with space. Honestly, I think like there's a lot of people looking at it, and there's definitely some applications that could be really beneficial. But for me, in my case, I would love to focus more on just everything around us, and just I think there's a lot more problems just at the planet, just on the planet's surface, uh, than looking into space. But definitely, like it's a largely untapped market. It's there's a lot of potential, and yeah,
A lot of
we'll see.
nothing as well.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
So you're not you didn't sign up for the contest to be one of the people to go to Mars then?
No, never. I would never.
Cool. So what's are there any announcements that the listeners might be interested, or are there any places where they might follow up or to get the report or anything like that?
So yeah, the report is confidential, but any interesting resources? I mean, I am also working not in geothermal space, but I'm working on an article around methanol, and that will normally also be published on Plug and Play blog and on Medium normally as well. Also going to be doing some more deep dives around anything AI and energy, also hydrogen more in the future. That's something I'm just also really passionate about. Regarding just geothermal, I would say, yeah, there's a couple of just good online sources. There's a couple of these blogs that just post a lot, like Think Geo Energy posts almost everything. It's pretty exciting. But if people are just interested in new types of technologies, I would just stay on the lookout for just EGS, AGS, and supercritical systems, because those three are just really what is moving, what is happening. And we'll probably see in the next 10 years some actual deployment of that. So that is definitely really exciting to see where that will happen and what kind of facilities will be set up. So yeah, I would keep an eye on those.
Great. Very nice. So our tagline here on Paglalayag is Tulay Tulay Lang, which just means keep going. Or Hangang sa abot tanaw is sort of like the horizon, like out as far as you can see. So that's sort of what we speak to, and with what we're talking about. So it was great to chat with you about all this, and I'll be following what you're doing from here for sure, and I'm sure some listeners will as well. So much
Absolutely.
appreciated, and yeah, unless you got any closing thoughts, we can sign up from here.
All good. Thanks a lot for inviting me.
Thanks as well.